Peace. The number that stops you, if you look at it long enough, is 8,031. That is how many Australians died in Japanese captivity during the Second World War out of 22,376 captured. Do the arithmetic, and it comes out to roughly 1 in 3. 1 in 3 men who surrendered to the Japanese did not come home. The Germans held Australian prisoners too. The death rate there was a fraction of 1%. The difference between those two numbers is not a footnote in military history. It is the entire moral piece. Architecture of the Pacific War. It is the reason this story exists. I want to be precise about what I'm going to tell you today. I am not going to tell you that the Australian soldier was a saint. He was not. None of them were on any side of any front in any war. What I am going to tell you is that there was a sequence of events, a very specific documentable sequence that began in early 1942 and did not end until the Japanese surrender in August 1945, a sequence that fundamentally altered how Australian soldiers understood their own survival and what they were prepared to do to protect it. Understanding that sequence requires starting somewhere most people don't, which is not COD and not Singapore. It requires starting with an obscure coconut plantation on the southern coast of New Britain, where something happened in February of 1942 that most Australians today have never heard of. Before we go further, I'm always curious where people are watching from. Drop it in the comments. Peace. Genuinely helps me understand who's out there listening. New Britain is an island, a long mountainous ridge of an island sitting in the Bismarck Sea, roughly the size of Tasmania. In January of 1942, it was an Australian territory administered under a League of Nations mandate dating back to 1920. The garrison there, known as Lark Force, numbered about 1,400 men centred on the 22nd Battalion. They had been sent to defend Rabaul, the territorial capital on the island's northeastern tip. What they had been given to defend it with was by any military standard a tragedy in waiting. No fighter cover worthy of the name, no artillery, no naval support, no extraction plan if things went wrong. When 5,000 Japanese troops landed at Rabaul on the 23rd of January, 1942, Lark Force was overrun. In a matter of hours, the commanding officer issued 3 words: every man for himself. What followed over the next few weeks was a desperate scramble through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Jungle. Ridges, mangrove swamps, rivers without bridges, heat that sat on a man like a physical weight. Some soldiers made it to the coast. Some were captured immediately. Some wandered for days and then, music, surrendered, exhausted and malarial, trusting that the Japanese would observe the conventions of war. Japan had publicly stated before hostilities began that while it had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention, it would respect its authority. The Australians surrendering in those weeks in early 1942 were at least partly counting on that promise. On the 3rd of February 1942, at Toll Plantation on New Britain's southern coast, approximately 160 Australian soldiers, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted, were taken prisoner. What happened next, was described in clinical post-war testimony by 6 men who survived it and by the very Japanese officer who ordered it, Colonel Masao Kochenos, shortly before he was tried for war crimes. The prisoners were divided into small groups. Their hands were bound. They were led separately into the jungle, and then they were bayoneted, shot or burned alive. 6 men survived. They feigned death or fell in positions the guards didn't check or were left for dead under the weight of other bodies. They came out of the jungle with stories that reached Port Moresby within weeks. 2 weeks after Toll, something happened on a different island, Amban in the Netherlands East Indies, that dwarfed even that, the Australian garrison at Laha Airfield. On Amban, part of a force called Gull Force had surrendered on the 3rd of February. Over the following 2 weeks, all of the prisoners at Laha, more than 200 men by the most conservative count and possibly closer to 300, were executed. They were killed in 4 separate massacres across the span of roughly 16 days. The method was consistent. Prisoners bound, led to prepared pits in a coconut plantation, and killed by sword or bayonet. The investigations by Australian war crimes prosecutors after The war recorded in affidavit testimony from Japanese participants that one of the massacres, in which approximately 220 men were killed, began at 6 o'clock in the evening and finished at 9. 3 hours, 220 men. The post-war investigation documents are extraordinarily detailed, partly because the investigators tracked down the perpetrators with unusual thoroughness, and partly because several Japanese participants gave testimony of unsettling clarity. One warrant officer described the sequence of events, the pit size, the position he stood in while directing the killings, the time it took. He remembered these things with precision. The Laha massacre was the largest single massacre of Australian prisoners of war during the entire conflict. In June of that same year, 1942, a Japanese transport ship called the Montevideo Maru left Rabaul unescorted and unmarked, carrying approximately 845 Australian military prisoners and 209 civilians. The Allies had no idea the ship was carrying prisoners. On the 1st of July in the South China Sea, the American submarine USS Sturgeon spotted it and fired. The Montevideo Maru sank in 11 minutes. Not one of the prisoners survived. It remains the largest maritime disaster in Australian history. The families of those men would not receive formal notification for months. Some never received it at all. This was the knowledge, not rumour, not propaganda, but documented survivor, attested knowledge that was circulating through Australian military command and among frontline troops by the time the COTA campaign began in July of 1942. Now, let me tell you about what it meant to be a Japanese soldier in 1942. Because to understand what happened next in Papua, you have to understand the world those soldiers inhabited and the belief system that shaped every decision they made, including the decision to die rather than surrender. The document that governed it was called the Senjin, issued to all Japanese army personnel in January of 1941. It was a field service code, but that description barely captures what it actually was. It was a moral framework, a statement about what it meant to be Japanese, to be a soldier, to serve the emperor, and one of its central principles was absolute. Surrender was not an option. The document stated this explicitly. To be taken prisoner was to bring shame not only upon oneself, but upon one's family, one's regiment, one's nation. In 1942, the army amended its criminal code to formally specify that any officer who surrendered soldiers under his command faced a minimum of 6 months' imprisonment, regardless of circumstances. The Japanese Foreign Ministry in 1943 stated publicly that the Japanese army maintained the position that Japanese prisoners of war did not exist. This is not a peripheral detail. This is the load-bearing wall. Because the Senkun didn't only shape Japanese behavior, it shaped Allied behavior in response to it. And it created over the course of the Papuan campaign and everything that followed. A dynamic that no one had anticipated and that no commander's directive could fully control. Kakakota. The word has a resonance in Australia that goes beyond military history. It has become something closer to myth, to sacred history, the track where Music Australia found itself, where young men from Victoria and Queensland and New South Wales discovered something about what they were capable of under conditions almost beyond description. But the myth, useful as it is, tends to smooth over things that deserve to be looked at directly. The jungle of the Owen Stanley Range is not a place that has ever accommodated sentimentality. The men of the 39th Battalion, the militia troops who took the first shock of the Japanese advance in late July of 1942, were undertrained, under-equipped, wearing khaki uniforms designed for the desert without artillery, and facing a Japanese force of seasoned veterans, Music, who outnumbered them many times over. They retreated south along the poor track through mud that could swallow a man to his thighs, through jungle so thick that at midday you couldn't see a man standing 5 meters away, through rain so constant it ceased to be weather and became environment. Malaria entry scrubbed typhus. Men so sick they walked open to the air because they could not manage buttons. A war that was being conducted simultaneously in their own bodies and in the terrain around them. What they found along that track, what those specific men in that specific Campaign discovered about what the Japanese did to prisoners was not theoretical. It was physical. It was what they saw with their own eyes. The journalist G. Reading, who was embedded with Australian forces in Papua, recorded in his 1946 account, Papuan's story is a description of the conditions during the retreat that has stayed with historians ever since. He wrote that no prisoners were taken on either side. No quarter was asked, and no quarter was asked, and no quarter was given. This was not a policy decision handed down, peace, from command. It was the outcome of a reality understood by the men on the ground on both sides of the track in the dark in the mud, with very little between them and death, except the speed at which they could move and the accuracy with which they could shoot. Quick pause for a moment. A surprising number of people watch these without subscribing. If you're finding the research worthwhile, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps keep the channel going. Anyway, back to where we were. The Japanese treatment of Australian wounded and captured along the track was well attested. Australian soldiers and missionaries at Sangara and along the Kota approach were beheaded. 2 Anglican nursing sisters, music, and a 7-year-old boy among a group taking shelter in the jungle were killed. A group of 5 men, 3 women, and a 6-year-old child were executed one by one. The child last. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern, music, and the pattern was becoming known. What the historian Mark Johnston later documented, drawing on diaries, court testimony, and post-war accounts, was that the killing of unarmed Japanese by Australian troops had become common during the Papuan campaign. Johnston is not a pessimist. He is a careful academic historian, and his conclusion is blunt. It was common. Australian command, aware of this, attempted to apply pressure on units to take prisoners for intelligence purposes. The troops proved, as Johnston put it, reluctant. General Major Paul Cullen gave testimony after the war that described what happened during the fighting at Erari on the Kakakota track. A leading platoon had captured 5 or 7 Japanese prisoners. They moved forward to the next engagement. The platoon behind them came up to the position, found the prisoners, and bayoneted them. Cullen was present. He said he found the killings understandable. He also said they had left him feeling guilty. That combination, understandable and guilty, is perhaps the most honest summary of the entire dynamic that existed in the Pacific from 1942 until the end of the war. Now consider what those words meant from the Japanese side of the wire. Because the Japanese soldier was not simply an obstacle. He was a man shaped by an institution and a culture that had been building toward this war for decades, who genuinely believed a number of things that determined how he fought. He believed surrender was shameful. He believed the emperor was divine and peace. That dying in his service was the highest form of honor available to a human being. He also believed, and this is where the cycle becomes most difficult to untangle, that if he were taken prisoner by the Allies he would be killed. This belief was partly cultivated by Japanese propaganda, which told soldiers that the enemy tortured and murdered prisoners as a matter of course. But it was also by the middle of the war, partly accurate, and becoming more so. Japanese soldiers could see what was happening to those who tried to surrender. The ratio of prisoners to dead in some phases of the Pacific campaign was, as the historian Niall Ferguson calculated, approximately 1 to 100. Let that settle for a moment. For every 1 Japanese soldier taken prisoner in certain phases of the Pacific War, approximately 100 were killed. 100 to 1, that is not a combat statistic. That is a statement about the nature of the war itself. The U.S. Office of War Information, the agency responsible for Allied peace. Wartime propaganda, acknowledged as much in a 1945 report. It noted with bureaucratic plainness that the unwillingness of Allied troops to take prisoners in the Pacific theater had made it difficult for Japanese soldiers to surrender. An American secret intelligence report from 1943 was even more direct. It stated that only the promise of ice cream and 3 days of leave would induce American troops not to kill surrendering Japanese. These are not comfortable documents. They are not the kind of peace material that makes it into commemorative ceremonies or school curricula, but they exist and they are part of the record. And understanding the Pacific War without them is like trying to understand a building without looking at its foundations. The Sandakan camp on the island of Borneo is where this story reaches its most unambiguous conclusion. Over 2,700 Australian and British prisoners were held there between 1942 and 1942 and 1945. Brought from Singapore to build an airfield for the Japanese garrison. By the 15th of August 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender, there was not a single living prisoner at Sandakan. They had been worked to death, starved to death, executed or had died on forced marches through the Bornean jungle, during which guards killed those who fell. Of the entire camp, 6 Australian soldiers survived. All 6 had escaped before the final marches. Not one man who remained lived to see liberation. Of the 22,000 Australians captured by the Japanese, 8,031 died in captivity. That is 36%. In German captivity, Australian death rates were a fraction of 1%. The disparity is not explained by geography or logistics alone. It is explained by a systematic institutional attitude embedded in the culture and enforced through command that prisoners were not merely an inconvenience, but an embarrassment. Evidence that a soldier had committed the supreme moral failure of allowing himself to be captured. The Imperial Japanese Army, in 1943, formally stated that its soldiers who were taken prisoner would be shot upon return to Japan. The Japanese government's official position was that those men simply did not exist. What emerged from all of this, from Tal and Laha and Kakakota and the successive music campaigns across New Guinea, from the knowledge of what was happening to Australians in captivity that filtered back through escaped soldiers, through intelligence reports, through the accounts of the 6 toll survivors, was not a policy. Policies are written down. They are signed and countersigned and filed in archive boxes. What emerged was something more organic and in some ways more durable, an understanding shared at the platoon level that the war in the Pacific operated by different rules than any other theatre, that the conventions which theoretically governed the treatment of the wounded and the captured had been suspended not by any order but by the facts of the ground, that the enemy's own code made it nearly impossible for those conventions to be observed by either side. Australian command never endorsed this understanding. They repeatedly directed that prisoners be taken specifically because a live Japanese soldier represented intelligence about dispositions, about supply lines, about plans that a dead one did not. The intelligence value of prisoners was real, and command knew it. But the gap between directive and action in the jungle of Papua and New Guinea was by all accounts enormous. There is a document from the Australian War Memorial, a medical report from the Papuan campaign in 1942 that describes men arriving at field stations so mentally altered by what they had experienced that ordinary categories of cause and effect had ceased to apply to their behaviour. These were not cowards. They were men who had been living for weeks in conditions that systematically dismantled the psychological structures that normally govern how a human being responds to another human being. The jungle at night, the proximity of death, the knowledge of what the Japanese had done to the wounded and captured. The understanding confirmed repeatedly by experience that a man on the ground reaching for a grenade was still a combatant. Major General Cullen's account of the Garari prisoners captured, passed over, found by the next platoon, killed, is among all the testimonies and reports and diary accounts perhaps the one that most clearly illustrates the mechanism by which all of this operated. No one issued an order to kill those men. No one had to. The men who did it simply made the decision that seemed in that environment, with that knowledge, rational. Cullen said he found it understandable, and then he said it left him feeling guilty, both things simultaneously, for the rest of his life. That is the honest accounting of this history. Not a simple story of brutality. Not a simple story of brutality. Not a simple story of righteous vengeance. A story about what happens when 2 military institutions with fundamentally incompatible relationships to the concept of surrender are placed in a jungle together for 3 years with imperfect information, exhausted bodies, and the accumulating weight of what each side has done to the other. The feedback loop that results is not pretty, it is documented. It involves real decisions made by real men under conditions of real extremity. And it did not end until the war itself ended. The final statistic, the one that perhaps closes the circle, is this. By the end of the war, the Western peace, Allies held somewhere between 38 and 50,000 Japanese prisoners. The exact figure is uncertain because many of those taken in the final weeks of the war, when the Japanese military was collapsing, were not processed through formal channels. But for a military that mobilized millions of men and fought across the breadth of the Pacific for nearly 4 years, 50,000 prisoners represents a vanishingly small fraction. Most of those taken in the earlier phases of the war, 1942, 1943, were captured because peace. They were too wounded or too ill to resist. Historian Alison B. Gilmore, who researched the Allied prisoner-taking record in the Southwest Pacific area with particular care, calculated that at least 19,500 Japanese were captured by Allied forces in that theater alone. But the distribution across the war was radically uneven. The great majority came in the later years as Japanese soldiers weakened by starvation and disease ceased in some cases to be capable of resistance. What that number tells, peace. US is that for the first 3 years of the Pacific War, during the Papone campaign, during the battles along the New Guinea coast, during the grinding advance through the islands, the taking of prisoners was not a feature of this conflict in any meaningful sense. It was not how the war was being fought. On either side, the Australians buried more than 8,000 of their own in Japanese captivity, in plantation pits on Among, in unmarked mass graves at Laha, in the jungle off the Kakakota track, peace. Along the Burma-Thailand Railway, in the sea east of the Philippines, when the Montevideo Maru went down. They buried them in places that in many cases weren't found until months or years after the war, ended when investigators with shovels and testimony went looking for what the ground had hidden. Among the men who survived and came home, who came back from Changangi and the railway and the jungle, there was a particular silence that families recognized and rarely pressed. Not the silence of men, peace, who had forgotten, the silence of men who had decided somewhere in those years that what they had seen and done and survived was not speakable in the terms available to ordinary life. That the distance between the jungle and the kitchen table was in some important way absolute. That silence is part of the record, too. 8,031 Australians died in Japanese captivity. The war in the Pacific was fought the way it was fought because of what that number meant to the men who were still alive to see it, peace. Accumulating. Not because they were savages, not because they were heroes, because they were men in a specific place at a specific time, fighting a war that had established through documented acts on documented dates in documented locations that certain rules no longer applied. History doesn't ask us to approve,